Welcome to Murder Most Foul, a podcast devoted to exploring famous murder cases of our time. Some solved, some unsolved, but all fascinating and guaranteed to raise the hairs on the back of your neck. I'm your host, Jim Solanowski. Today's episode: A Devil Went Down to Georgia. The 1987 murder of Lita McClinton Sullivan sent shockwaves through the affluent Atlanta suburb of Buckhead, Georgia, like few other crimes before it. The neighborhood, with its stately mansions and top-tier schools, was simply not the kind of place where women were gunned down in cold blood in broad daylight. How many socialites had enemies so dangerous they would be murdered by a hitman pretending to deliver roses on an early winter morning? In A Devil Went Down to Georgia, award-winning writer Deb Miller Landau details the shocking events that followed Lita's murder in 1987, including the surprising lack of evidence, racial bias in the justice system, and the international manhunt for Lita's killer. Full of twists and turns, legal battles, and the McClinton family's unrelenting dedication to justice, Landau's rigorous investigation is the first complete account of this tragic American crime. And it is my honor to welcome Deb Miller Landau to Murder Most Foul. Welcome, Deb.
Thank you.
So before we get into the case / the book, which we will be promoting throughout the podcast and where people can get it and your website, all that will be done before we get to the end. But let's share with my audience a little bit about your background. A lot of authors come from journalism, or they come from law, or they're just people like to write icky true crime books. How did you, what is your background?
So I came to this story. I was a journalist and then a travel guidebook writer, and I was living I'm Canadian, and I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and writing a travel guidebook about Savannah, Charleston, and the Carolina coast, and sort of learning about the history of the South as really an outsider. And then I started doing some writing for Atlanta Magazine, and my editor there asked me to do a retrospective on a murder that happened in 1987. So this was around 2002, 2004, and asked me to do a retrospective about this very, huge case that happened in Atlanta that I had never heard of. And that was about the murder of Lita McClinton Sullivan, who was gunned down in broad daylight on a January day in 1987. And so I kind of fell into the research, and, it was a crazy story with so many twists and turns, and nobody at that point had been convicted of her murder. And it was really kind of like, why not? It seemed pretty straightforward and cut and dried. And I got really into the research and ended up writing a story for Atlanta Magazine, which was later anthologized in the Best American Crime Writing. But that was now almost 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago. And I finally decided to write a book.
We have a small cast of characters, and I've listed them, and they expand, of course. But the main folks are Lita. Is it Lita or Lita?
Lita. Yep.
Lita McClinton Sullivan is the victim. Jim Sullivan is the divorced, in the process of divorce, the husband. And Tony Harwood is one of the people who is, of course, convicted in the crime. So I think one of the ways, again, and you do this well in your book, you bring us from like the past to the present to the future. There's a little play going on, and you do start, which is important, of painting a picture of Lita and Jim and their progression through their courtship and marriage, and then the dissolution of that marriage, which ends up in her being murdered. So take it back as far as you'd like to take it about that background on Jim and Lita.
Sure. Yeah. So Lita McClinton grew up she was born in 1952 in Atlanta. And she was born to Emory and Joanne McClinton, who were very, very active in Democratic politics in Georgia. And they were a Black family, but lived in a part of Atlanta, in West Atlanta, that was sort of very affluent Black suburb that used to be white, but white segregationists sort of fled for the suburbs when the Black community started sort of building their own homes. And so it was a really sort of nexus of Black power in Atlanta. Their parents were sort of staunch Catholics, sticklers for Southern etiquette, very well educated, and also very well informed on things like sort of civil rights. And they talk with their friends around, what would the desegregation of schools look like. And Lita had a sister and a brother, and in quick succession. And Lita was just sort of an extroverted, effervescent young girl who was really sort of curious and bubbly, and just, really kind of a lovely person to be around. And she grew up, in her first 20 years of her life, she grew up and saw, she saw the passing of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and one of the big ones is the passing of in 1967 of Loving versus Virginia, which was the national federal ban on miscegenation laws around the country. And miscegenation laws forbade interracial couples from getting married. So, as all things in the South, it took a little bit longer for that to sort of take hold in Atlanta. So it was pretty surprising when in 1976, Lita had graduated from Spelman College, and which is an HBCU, an all women's historically Black college in Atlanta. And she'd studied political science, but her real love was for fashion. And so she worked at a boutique in one of Atlanta's high-end malls. And in walks this guy named Jim Sullivan in 1976. So just to set the stage, interracial couples were not common. And it was very rare. And Lita's family knew how hard that would be for their daughter to kind of be in a relationship like that. But Jim waltzed in. He was 10 years older than Lita. He had this sort of quirky way about him. He was, had this brash kind of New England accent, and sort of this way about him that was very, little bit abrasive to the Southern kind of manner. But he just, absolutely showered her with love and attention. Today we would call it love bombing, but back in the day we didn't call it that. And he just, sort of swept her off her feet. So that was in 1976. 6 months later, they ended up getting married and moved to Macon, Georgia, where Jim had inherited his uncle's liquor distributorship business. So sort of overnight, Jim had become this very wealthy millionaire. And I should say that the night before the wedding, he kind of surprised Lita with two pretty dramatic things. One was a prenuptial agreement that he asked her to sign. And she was a little thrown by that, but sort of, okay, I trust you, and I'll sign the prenup. And then he said, oh, by the way, I have an ex-wife and 4 children all living in Boston. And it was one of those bombs that sort of, should have probably ended everything, but, the guests were here, the flowers had arrived, everything was in motion. So they went through with the wedding and moved to Macon, Georgia, which is, still today a pretty segregated place. And they moved to kind of like the wealthy white part of town. And so it was a real sort of challenging time for Lita. But that was the beginning of their relationship.
They set up housekeeping, if you will, but things slowly, or it's not even slowly, very quickly. He was a controlling man. So why don't you go forward with what the relationship as it deteriorated in the wedding and the marriage. And again, we should point out, which is a good thing, they had no children, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So they at first, they were, kind of like young lovers, and he had wealth, and so they took a lot of trips and they had a lot of fun, and it was, a great relationship in the beginning, but soon the cracks started to sort of show through, and Jim would suddenly become, really, really frugal. Like he would swipe condiments from restaurants to take them home, and he would wear his dead uncle's clothing. And he didn't want Lita to work, but put her on a very restricted sort of what he called her allowance. That out of that she was supposed to pay for anything to do with the house. So if he was, picking up milk or dog food on his way home, he would dock that from her pay on a list on the fridge. And so she was feeling more and more just kind of controlled, and then he would be extravagant outside of the house, but inside it was sort of getting, he was just grouchy and extraordinarily frugal. And she had fought with her parents to sort of defend him and for this marriage to happen, and she started feeling sort of more and more isolated and alone because she felt like she couldn't, she was failing the relationship somehow. She was a devout Catholic as well. And, the thought of divorce wasn't something that was even on her radar. And so, she sort of threw herself into trying to make friends in Macon and getting very involved in charitable activities and things like that. And then she just began to suspect that Jim was potentially having some extracurriculars with other women. And she started sort of, accusing him, and they would sort of begin this cycle of, she would accuse, he would deny, and then he would buy her expensive jewelry or furs or something. And the whole thing would start all over again. So, again, we didn't have the language for it then, but we probably look at it and think that, he was very controlling and sort of gaslighting and lying to her about what was happening. And, so that was a sort of contentious time, but they sort of go in and out of things working and then not working and then working again and trying to make it work. And then suddenly, about 5 years into their marriage, he decides he's sort of had enough of Macon, and without telling Lita, decides to sell the company. And with the proceeds, he decides, again, without telling Lita, to buy a mansion in Palm Beach, Florida.
She goes with him, right? Initially, she stays with him. We haven't gotten to we're going to now hire lawyers yet, but there's again in the book, this is wonderful texture and wonderful background. This poor schlep, until he kills somebody, he's a poor schlep. And he thinks he's going to be down there and going to be part of the tennis crowd and the glitterati down there. And that's not going to make it. That's not going to happen. Yeah. So even this big move, which investing in a big house, not a lot of equity now and all, and now I'm here and it's not even fulfilling my dream.
Right. So he moves to Palm Beach, Florida, and buys Casa Lita, which is a 17,000 square foot mansion, just down the road from where Mar-a-Lago is today. And, there's a private, tunnel that goes under the highway to a private beach. And it's really a huge step up. And it's sort of, he's got, these social aspirations to be in the big leagues, to be one of the sort of rich and famous in Palm Beach. And it doesn't sort of realize what quite all that takes, and quickly realizes that having a Black wife is not, helping his social aspirations in any way. So, again, they sort of go through we've got this new big, beautiful house, let's furnish it and redecorate things. And then it starts to sort of happen again, that things start to devolve. And she believes that he's, starting up affairs with women again. And she convinces him to buy a condo in Atlanta because they're going back there a lot so she can visit her family and friends. And so they buy a condo in Buckhead, Georgia, which is probably the wealthiest, whitest neighborhood in Georgia. And but they buy a condo there, and they up there together occasionally, and then she ends up sort of going up there alone and spending more and more time with her family and friends in Atlanta, and then coming back to Florida. And then on one of these trips back, she finds a women's lingerie in her marital bed. And as I say in the book, it was kind of the bra that broke the camel's back. And, she decides, I'm out. I'm totally done with this. It's now, they've been married for 8+ years. And so she hitches a U-Haul to her Mercedes and drives the 600 miles back to Atlanta, and then files for divorce. Now, what follows is 2 years of just absolute contentious divorce proceedings, and he's using his, wealth and power to fight every little thing, every step of the way. And what becomes clear in all of this is that, of the 3 houses that they own, of all of quote unquote, her jewelry, anything like of value, their cars, it's all in his name. So she's never technically owned any of it. And she's fighting for what seems like a reasonable, dissolution of marriage. And he's, really digging in because he's losing money by this point, and he is really digging in and doesn't want to give her anything. So he cuts her off, and it's this very, very, intense, contentious 2 years. Now, on the eve of what was to be a pivotal, court decision in the division of assets, Lita's sort of at home in Atlanta, really eager for this part of the proceedings to be over, because from here on, it's sort of like once the judge makes this ruling, all sort of people are thinking that it's going to go her way. And that morning, she doesn't sleep very well. She has a friend who stays over the night with her toddler daughter to kind of help lend moral support to Lita. And then early in the morning, court's supposed to start at 2:00, and at 8:00 in the morning, she gets a ring at her doorbell, and she eyewitnesses later report hearing her say, good morning. And there's a man at the door carrying a long white box with a pink ribbon around it. And he sort of forces his way into the foyer and hands her the box, and then reaches into his jacket pocket and takes out a gun. He shoots her once and it misses, and they later find bullet fragments, all throughout the house. And the second one, she sort of holds up the flower box almost to shield herself from the bullet, which is, of course, a futile attempt to do that. And the bullet went straight through the flower box and hit her in the head. And 20 minutes later, she died at Piedmont Hospital, which was where she was born. And it was an incredibly massive story and tragic story in Atlanta. And it became this sort of, it really blew up partially because of, her parents were very well known in the community, but it was also just really, really unusual at the time to have a murder happen in broad daylight in Buckhead, and a Black woman in Buckhead at that. So it was a really, really big story at the time.
And you mentioned that the case, I don't think that was your coining of the phrase, but the case was called the Flower Box Murder.
Among other things, yeah.
That's apropos. And so, like with these, obviously the shock, you expect something to happen, a robbery or something, but, as you say, broad daylight, in someone's house, not on the street, not, an altercation. So the police still obviously jump on a neighbor, I believe, was out. Just, these things my wife and I admit were bad witnesses. I couldn't tell you what she left today with what she was wearing. I can't tell you. I saw it. I said goodbye. I can't tell you. But the witness, the next door neighbor or neighbor nearby, remembers seeing the man at the door. He must have then left before the shots, or because the shooter went into the foyer, he may not have heard it. But a neighbor actually saw someone minutes, obviously by timing wise, minutes before. Was he then the first? Was he the first person over there, or was there somebody, other neighbor who came in? And the friend upstairs, of course.
Yeah. So Poppy, Lita's best friend, who was upstairs with her daughter, of course, heard the shots but didn't know what was happening. So she hid in the closet because she didn't know what was going on. A neighbor, Bob Christian, and his condo was right next door to Lita's, like an actual, like attached to it. And he had been out putting his trash in the garbage bin, and and he saw this guy sort of delivering flowers and thought, it's kind of a strange time of day. It's sort of early in the morning to deliver flowers. And there was something about the guy that made the, hair on the back of his neck stand up. And so he sort of, kind of kept an eye on him. And by this point, the neighbors knew Lita well, and kind of took her under their wings, and because she was sort of basically at this point a woman living alone. And so Bob sort of watched and actually kind of locked eyes with the flower delivery man, and just had this really sort of bad feeling, and then was waiting for his wife to get ready for work, and was sort of in his garage, just sort of keeping an eye on the guy, and then heard the shots, and then minutes or seconds later saw the guy running at full speed out of the condominium complex. And Bob sort of had this decision to make. Does he go run after the guy, or does he go to Lita? And he chose to go to Lita. And meantime, another neighbor across the courtyard also sort of heard the sounds. He said it sounded like two pots being banged together, and then saw the guy running, and then tried to sort of follow him, visually out of his house. So Bob runs over to Lita's house and finds her still alive, and calls 911. And he's trying to, do whatever he can for her. And the police come instantly, sort of right away. There was a police officer just down the road, came right away and sort of was holding on to Lita's hand. And, he later testified that she sort of squeezed his hand almost in a way of reassuring him when he was trying to reassure her. So, I mean, it was really tragic. She got taken to the hospital and then died, like I said, about 20 minutes later. And, at this point, they are trying to put the pieces together. And, this is, just a reminder, it's 1987. We're not using cell phones. There aren't cell towers pinging anything. You don't have cameras everywhere. You don't have the internet widely used. And you don't have a linked fingerprinting system in the country that isn't a thing yet. And so it's real sort of boots on the ground detective work that's required. And so the first detectives were a man named Welcome Harris and his partner, and they were both Black detectives, and they got there probably 30 minutes later, and they're homicide detectives. So, whoever called them knew that it did not look good that Lita would survive. So they get there and start processing the place. And even the Black detectives are like, well, what's going on here? What is this Black woman doing living in this, super luxurious condominium? So that sort of, set the stage for how the initial investigation was going to go. And almost right away, Lita's family said, well, it must have been Jim. Jim would have had something to do with it. And pretty much everyone else did too. And so, the police questioned Jim, but he was down in Florida with his, new mistress. So he had an alibi. And the early investigation, they couldn't find anything at all to tie him to her murder. And at her funeral, which happened just a couple of days after the murder, it was pretty quick, happened just a couple of days after the murder, the family had to seek his permission to have their daughter cremated. And he sent a telegram saying, you have my permission, Jim Sullivan. And didn't come to the funeral, didn't send flowers, didn't, send a condolence card to the parents, which was really, really telling. It doesn't matter how contentious your divorce is. They were married for almost 10 years. So it was he seemed like the prime suspect for a long, long time. But he remained free for another 20 years almost. Well, what happens is, he is tried in federal court, in they try him on a not for murder, but for a statute that sort of a not very well-known statute at the time, that basically said that if you use the phone in the orchestration of a murder,
There you go.
there was a 5-year sort of statute that they had to prosecute him and or bring him to trial. So they, there were basically 6 days left before so 5 years after the murder, they bring him to court at federal court, and he gets acquitted. And it's a real just gut punch to the family and to everyone involved. And so the family basically tries to take away the one thing that's the most important thing to him, which is his money. So they pursue a wrongful death suit in Florida. Now, in a civil suit, the burden of proof is lesser than in a criminal trial. And as in a criminal trial, the penalty is jail time, whereas in a civil case, it's financial. So they really wanted to take his money away so that he wouldn't be able to continue to be paying these like high-priced lawyers to keep getting off. And a jury, basically decided that he was guilty in a wrongful death suit. That went through appeals over and over again, but they concluded that he owed the family $4 million. They never ever saw a penny of that. So fast forward to 1998, it's now 11 years after the murder, and the family is, based on the advice of their lawyer, still trying to kind of keep it in the press, still trying to keep their foot on the gas as it relates to, the authorities and the investigators. And, it happens a lot in cold cases where, if not for the families really, really pushing to make something happen, nothing would. And so they did an episode of the television show Extra. And in it, they sort of made pleas for, any information regarding Lita's murder, and they showed footage of Jim Sullivan and a woman in Texas who was a receptionist at a law firm, caught wind that this Extra episode was out and recognized Jim Sullivan as a man who her then trucker boyfriend had received money from at a truck stop in Florida roughly 11 years ago. So she tells her boss, the boss gets in touch with the Atlanta police, he gets in touch with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and that starts the ball rolling. And they have the woman, her name is Belinda, they have her try to contact her boyfriend at the time and get him to admit that he was involved. And so they tape all these recordings between her and a guy named Philip Anthony Harwood, or Tony Harwood. And they eventually get enough. And so Tony is living in Albemarle, North Carolina, and the GBI goes and knocks on his door and says, you're under arrest. And the first thing Tony says is, I've been waiting for you boys for a long, long time. So that sort of starts to snowball, sort of everything. So Tony eventually gives up Jim Sullivan, and he says that Jim paid him $25,000 to, quote unquote, take care of Lita, and back in early or late 1996. And so once they arrest Tony gives up Jim. And at the time, the district attorney was sort of, basically slapping, him and his guys on the back, saying, look at what we did. We've solved this crime. Finally, we've arrested the hitman, and more arrests are coming. And now Lita's family was like, you might as well have just sort of told Jim, like, hey, Jim, we're coming for you. You better run, because that's exactly what he did. So before they were able to arrest him, Jim totally vanished. And they followed him to Costa Rica and then sort of lost the thread. And they realized that he had gone to Costa Rica and Panama and Venezuela, and then sort of into the wind. So Jim, who is this, multi-millionaire who was living in a 17,000 square foot mansion, is suddenly on the FBI's most wanted list. They've got Interpol looking for him. He's just a ghost. He's gone. 8 months after Lita's murder, Jim gets married to Suki Rogers, who is a thrice divorced, Korean-born socialite in Palm Beach, who's drop dead gorgeous and sort of, the ultimate kind of trophy. And, she's somebody that the Palm Beach Society can kind of get their heads around because she's, that's sort of been her role is to sort of be this, arm candy. And so Jim gets married to Suki. They, again, just they basically like travel all over the place, spend money like it's, going out of style. They have this sort of wild and crazy, couple years relationship. And then, basically, Jim gets into a car accident. He's driving around in his Rolls Royce and gets into a fender bender. And Jim was a guy who was like, oh, parking tickets, I'm not, who needs to pay those? Like he's sort of above the law kind of thing. So he's got all of these parking tickets basically stacked up against him, and he's got expired tags. So the day he goes to traffic court, he kind of comes up with this strategy that he's going to get Suki to say that she was the one driving the car so that he's not going to get in trouble for it. So Suki agrees to kind of lie on his behalf and in court. And there's a reporter in court called Frank Serabino who wrote for the Palm Beach Post, and he's sitting there and he's thinking like, well, wait a minute, what? Suki wasn't driving, Jim was driving. So he gets in touch with the cop, the original ticketing cop, and says, was Suki driving? And he said, of course Suki wasn't driving, Jim was driving. You don't think I would know who's driving a convertible Rolls Royce, And so Jim gets basically nailed for perjury. And by this point, Suki's kind of getting over the whole thing. And so she files for divorce. And they have, tabloid fodder divorce proceedings where, it's all sorts of crazy stuff. Like she, hoarded sort of cosmetics and hid them under the bed as a way of like making money. And, he and hoarded like pantyhose, and he brought makeup and, Clinique boxes and all these pantyhose into court. And it was this, reporters were eating it up. And it was sort of Jim's kind of fall from grace again. And at this point, Jim had been a sort of, functioning member of the community. He was on the, Landmarks Preservation Commission. He was, helped the mayor get reelected. But he's starting to sort of really fall from grace now. Like not only has he been involved as a potential suspect in the murder of his prior wife, he's now, going through this sort of embarrassing divorce with Suki. He's got a perjury charge.
Now, I want to again put it in here. Correct me if I'm wrong. I take clips from the book. I believe this was in their divorce, Suki and Jim, where she says in divorce court, quote, he hired someone to murder her. I thought I'd be next. Did she say that in open court?
She did. Yes.
And at that point, they don't, this is only 5-6 months, like you said, after it's not the 20 years. It's soon after the murder, or is it much later?
It's a few years. It's a few years after the murder.
A few years.
Nothing's been going. Yeah.
All right. I just wanted to verify.
Yeah. So Jim's lawyers basically paint Suki as this sort of gold digger, liar who would say anything.
Okay, but it's shocking to read it in print.
It's shocking. It's, and everyone is listening and watching. And so Lita's family's watching, and all the lawyers are watching, and the FBI and the GBI, and they're like, Suki dropped this bomb in court, but it sort of gets shoved under the rug, and she's sort of discredited. And the judge basically ends up, really siding with Jim in the divorce. So he gets off on that one pretty scot clean as well. But by now his reputation is tarnished, his money is starting to go. He sells the mansion in Palm Beach, moves to another part of Florida, and, gets this perjury charge on which he gets his penalty is house arrest. So he actually, the first one, he gets house arrest and he's still living in the mansion. And he's rattling around in his 17,000 square foot mansion with an ankle bracelet. He's allowed to go to work, but he doesn't really work. He doesn't really have an office, but he's allowed to go to an office from 9 to 5 every day. He's allowed to play tennis every day. So essentially, it's kind of a BS, charge, right? And so once again, he's got, lawyers who help get him off. So it was right around Thanksgiving in 1996, and Jim and Suki are living together at the mansion in Palm Beach. And Jim is having some furniture, a piano, and some, furniture delivered from the house in Macon that he still owns. It's having it delivered down to some furniture down to Florida. So a trucker named Philip Anthony Harwood, Tony Harwood, gets the gig to move the furniture. So he drives from Macon to Florida and hires some local laborers to help do the unloading. And he drives up to, the house, and, he's like thinking to himself, one of these windows would cost more than I would make in a year, so he's pretty dazzled by the whole thing. The way he explains it, it wasn't really that big of a deal. It wasn't that nice of a house, but at the time it would have been pretty dazzling for him. And while his laborers are sort of unloading the furniture, Jim is kind of guiding them and sort of telling them, barking out orders and things like that. And Tony looks at him and sort of sees this little fastidious guy and thinks like, oh, maybe there's something in this for me. And so he starts, shooting the shit with him. And, Jim says, he gets Jim talking, and Jim sort of fesses up that he's got this, this wife up in, or this, estranged wife up in Atlanta who's trying to take him for everything he's got. And, in the meantime, Tony sort of sees Suki in the shadows, and sort of goes, oh, okay, I see what's happening here. And he says, to Jim, like, well, you could probably, take care of that. I could probably find the right people to take care of that problem for you. And next thing you know, Jim is drawing a map to where the condo is in Atlanta. And, Tony sort of doesn't think anything of it at the time and says, it probably cost you about 25 grand. Doesn't think anything of it at the time, leaves, and, a couple of weeks later gets money and is delivered to his mailbox in North Carolina. And sort of it was like the down payment. And so things moved pretty quickly after that. When, much later they found out that after the hit was done, Tony called Jim from a payphone that was about 45 minutes away from Atlanta, 45 minutes after the murder. And he called him and just said, Merry Christmas, because it was sort of supposed to be done around Christmas time. And now it's, January 16th, which was pretty devastating for the family to hear in court, for every year afterwards. But going back to when Tony's arrested in 1998, he gives up Jim Sullivan. Jim Sullivan vanishes, and he's gone. They can't find him for another 5 years. And so in 2002, they get another television show, results in a tip. And so a guy in Chiang, Thailand, which is 80 miles south of Bangkok, is watching an old episode of FBI's Most Wanted and says, oh my God, that's that grouchy old guy that lives, in the building. And they're living in a luxurious resort, and Jim is living with yet another woman, and a Thai woman. And he's got his name on the door. And so the guy calls the police, and they call the FBI. And for 2 months, they surveil Jim Sullivan because they want to make sure that they've got the right guy, that they've got all their, paperwork and ducks in a row. And then they go and knock on his door and say, you're under arrest. And Jim's totally surprised, says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have anything to do with this. So right around that time, that's when I got a hold of the story. So it's all that time it's 15 years after the murder, and I'm doing a retrospective. In the meantime, Jim is sitting in a Thai prison, and it's at a time when Amnesty International produced a report talking about the depravity of Thai prisons. It's not pleasant. There's no air conditioning and they're overcrowded. They have not enough food and the food that they eat is terrible. But Jim decides that he would rather, stay there and fight extradition than come back and face the music in Atlanta. So he hires, the same top defense attorneys that he had used before, and is somehow sort of paying these top attorneys and using his, wealth again to kind of do whatever he can to fight extradition back to Atlanta. He fights for 2 years until he is finally denied. His pleas to prevent extradition were denied, and he's flown back to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, and he's wearing, a mask. These are the days before we wore masks, a surgical mask, because he's got, a abscessed tooth. He's got gout on his foot, so he's only wearing one shoe. Looks a little rough, basically slept or read a Newsweek magazine the whole way through and comes back to Atlanta and sort of has to face the music. It takes another, 4 years after his arrest before he's brought to trial in Atlanta. And then, when that starts, it's March of 2006 and, it's been, March of 2006. It's been all this time, since 19 years since Lita's murder. And the family is, feeling nervous because Jim is just, never, ever accountable for anything. He says, I had nothing to do with it. I had nothing to do with it. And so basically what they have is Tony and Belinda. And Tony and Belinda are a little bit of a mess. Their stories are never the same twice. Belinda's, obviously terribly, terribly nervous about testifying against Tony. So Belinda has arranged to have immunity for herself. So whatever she says, she can't be implicated in the murder. But she's a nervous wreck. Tony sort of suddenly, has this whole story about saying that he wasn't the shooter and that he actually sort of subcontracted it out, and comes across as this, really unreliable witness, and he's sort of the prosecution's star witness. So the family and everybody else involved, everyone in Atlanta is watching with bated breath, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, he's going to get off again, and Jim is going to get off again. So the trial goes on and on and on. It takes forever to get a jury, and the trial goes on and on and on. And they are seeking the death penalty against Jim for arranging this murder. And finally, there's a verdict and everyone is on the edge of their seats. Jim's own brother has come and given a statement to the press about what a horrible guy he is. The family has come Lita's family has come one by one to sort of talk about, how brutal the loss has been in their family, by giving victim impact statements. And, it's touch and go. And finally, the jury ends up basically convicting Jim on 5 counts, but they do not give him the death penalty. So he is currently incarcerated in Georgia and will live the rest of his life in a 6x8 cell. Here's a guy who lived in relative luxury for much of his life, and now he's living in a prison cell and has been there for a long time.
Just to clear up a couple of things about the trial, is that Tony, though, during it, after it, whatever's claiming he's not the shooter, he didn't. What was his take, either to the authorities or on the stand, about the rest of the gang? Did he claim he didn't know who they were? He picked them up off a work detail somewhere. I mean, how it would have helped him, quote unquote, if he wasn't the shooter, at least to point the finger at some other folks, and that could get him a little bit more consideration. But if I remember from the book, he's the only one that went down. And Jim.
Well, Tony, during the trial, he'd been in jail kind of waiting for the police to find Jim for 5 years before he offered up this sort of new story. And that was that he had hired a guy that he called John the bartender. And that he found through a stripper friend and named Tracy. And so it was sort of like Tracy and John, the bartender, were suddenly involved in the story. And everybody's like, well, why is it taking you 5 years to tell that part of the story? And so he was saying that he had paid this John guy to do the shooting, that Tony had orchestrated the whole thing, but that he didn't actually pull the trigger. Nobody really believed him. Tony had basically, in exchange for his testimony against Jim, he got instead of life in prison, he got a 20-year manslaughter sentence. So he served that and got out of prison in 2018. And that's, he'd served his 20 years. And I met with him 5 years after that. So he'd been out for 5 years by the time I caught up with him.
And you arranged this after he was out? You tracked him down after that, or how did you communicate? How did you get in touch with him? And then obviously you set up a meeting.
So when I decided that I was going to write the book, I really wanted to talk to Tony, and it's not super easy to find people who don't want to be found. So, but I tried it I found several potential email addresses and saw some Facebook posts that could or could not have been him, found out who his family members were, and sort of tracked him down. And so our first correspondence was actually, I'd sent him a bunch of different messages from a bunch of different ways. And I one day was out at the grocery store, and all of a sudden my phone rings and I don't recognize the number. And usually I don't answer when I don't recognize the number, but somehow I did. And I said, hello, and he said, this is Tony Harwood. And he's got this real deep, real Southern sort of voice. And I was like, oh my God, because it had been months and months. And I said, can I get 5 minutes to get home and call you back? And so I did. And we ended up talking for an hour and a half, I think, that day, and like several times afterwards. And exchanging emails back and forth. And, it was so interesting to me that now, all this time later, he'd served 20 years in prison. He, could no longer be convicted of anything. He was still so very adamant that he wasn't the shooter. And, it had this sort of, Tony really likes to be liked. And so, was friendly and, struggling out of prison. He's a guy who grew up in pretty severe poverty and spent, a lot of his formative years in prison for burglary, and had a grade 9 education. And, there are things about Tony that make you sort of see him as a human being, not just as somebody who did this terrible thing. And, I think it haunts him to this day, even though he's not really forthcoming because he says somebody else did the shooting, that he doesn't sort of see himself responsible for it. And it doesn't matter how many times I say to him, well, you did take the money and make it all happen, and if not for you. So that's troubling. But yeah, he still is convinced. And other people have said that, sometimes criminals convince themselves so much of something that they start to believe it. And so that could be the case as well. I was going to Atlanta to do some research for the book. And I said to Tony, I'm like, what about if I flew to Charlotte? And he lives outside of Charlotte, and I'll come and visit you. And he said, well, maybe. And then it was getting closer and closer to the date. And then he just completely ghosted me. And so I kept telling him, well, I'm going to be in town this date and these dates. And I took a red eye from Portland to Charlotte and rented a car. And the only car that I could rent, the only one that they had available, was a minivan. And so I'm driving around in this minivan in the town that Tony lives in, and sort of trying to get the lay of the land. It's really early in the morning. I'm texting him and texting him and texting him, and he's not texting me back. And I'm thinking, I'm so tired because I've gotten no sleep. So I pull into this park, and it's freezing cold. It was January, and just unseasonably cold for North Carolina. And I pull into this park, and I think, like, okay, I'm just going to crash out for a little bit. There's no one around. It's like cold, and there's a lake, and I'm sort of parked in front of the lake, and think I'm going to just, have a snooze and then figure out what to do. So I do that, and I wake up, and I think, okay, I'm just going to, and at this point, it's like 9 o'clock in the morning. And so I pick up the phone and call him. And to my surprise, he answers, and he says, "Where are you at?" And I said, "Well, I'm in Albemarle." And he said, "Yeah, I know. Where are you?" And I had already, in my drive around town, sort of figured out a good coffee shop to go to where I could like record an interview, and it wouldn't be too noisy, but there would be people around, and it would be warm and safe. And I said, "Well, right now I'm at City Lake Park, and then he said, "I'll be there in 5 minutes," and click. And I was like, "Oh my God, there's literally no one around. No one in the world knows where I am." So I
and a murderer is coming, but
a murderer's coming, right?
And he comes,
and he shows up, and he has his sort of new girlfriend who had just gotten out of the hospital with him. She's got a hot pink tote that has an oxygen tank in it. He's smoking. And I sort of say, like, "Well, why don't I take y'all for breakfast?" And he said, "No, we'll just do it in your minivan." So the three of us climb into the minivan. I was in the driver's seat, he was in the passenger seat, and the girlfriend was in the back seat. And we talked for a good 3 hours,
wow.
Sitting in the car, and he would get out every now and again to smoke. And then I would chat with the girlfriend. But it was pretty, and it's like I thought of him as the sort of larger than life character, and then he's now in his 70s, and he's got back problems, and he's just sort of smaller than my imagination at that point. And I felt nervous for sure to meet him. Also felt really like I wanted to make sure that I didn't dishonor Lita or her family by meeting him and potentially even having some compassion for him. So that was sort of conflicting when, he turns up and he's this sort of flawed human being like the rest of us. And so it was definitely an interesting moment. And then, by the time he leaves, I'm just, absolutely drained, and I've got to drive back to Atlanta. And I look at my phone, and there's, 400 texts from my friends saying, "What's going on?" And,
So as we're closing up, any thoughts at the end, what you're doing now? Do you have a project in activity now? And also certainly how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm excited to say that the book is a finalist for the Edgar Allan Poe Awards that is going to be announced on May 1st. I'm in with some really great companies.
You heard it here first, folks.
I've been doing a lot of talks and conversations around the big themes in this book, about, how we talk about domestic abuse, how we talk about race and wealth as it relates to the justice system, and just sort of some really big themes about what's going on today. So this book sort of just it's been out for 6 months, and, kind of keeps me busy. And I've got several projects on the go, and I'm excited for all of them.
So again, the book is available. I got mine at the library because my wife says I can't buy any more books. Sorry, but the library bought it, so you get $1.50 or something. And of course, it's Amazon, it's Barnes and Noble. You can get it as Kindle. I don't like Kindle books; they're poorly laid out. But you can buy the hard copy. I also recommend, if you've got a brick and mortar bookstore in your town, please use them. Because if they don't have the book, they can get it for you for another $1.50, and you're supporting local entrepreneurs. So that's my soapbox speech. So again, how can people reach you, get a hold of you if they want to do something like this, or even just want to compliment you on your wonderful book, how can they reach you?
You can reach me through my website, which is DebWord.com. And I'm on Instagram at DML_author.
Thank you, Deb.
Thank you so much for having me.